You're not the image we present to clients." The sentence didn't echo. It cut, clean and deliberate, like it had been practiced in rooms just like this one. Danielle Brooks sat across the polished glass table, hands resting loosely in her lap, posture relaxed, eyes steady. She didn't flinch. She didn't need to. The office around her was everything you'd expect from a top-tier consulting firm. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking downtown Chicago, sunlight bouncing off steel and glass, a skyline built on ambition and quiet exclusion. 3 executives sat across from her, each one dressed in tailored suits that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent, their expressions controlled but their judgment already decided. One of them, a man in his early 50s with silver at his temples, tapped her resume with 2 fingers but didn't open it. Not once. Not even a glance. Danielle noticed that. She noticed everything. The second executive leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, studying her the way people study something they don't quite understand but have already made up their mind about. "We're looking for a certain presence," he added, his tone softer now, but somehow sharper. Danielle tilted her head slightly, her voice calm, almost curious. "Define presence." The room shifted just a little. A flicker of discomfort passed between them, subtle but real. The third executive, a woman with a tight smile and sharper eyes, stepped in quickly. "Someone our clients feel comfortable with," she said. There it was. Not loud, not explicit, but clear enough to land. Across the room, seated near the corner with a tablet in hand, a young intern named Jason Miller stopped typing. His fingers hovered midair as he looked up, eyes moving from Danielle to the executives, then back again. Something about the exchange didn't sit right with him. Danielle noticed that too. She had trained herself to read rooms like this, rooms where decisions were made before conversations even started. She'd seen this moment before. Different city, different table, same energy. At 23, when a recruiter told her she was impressive, but not quite the right fit. At 27, when a client meeting shifted the moment she walked in and never recovered. At 31, when she watched less qualified candidates move forward while she was told to keep trying. Those memories didn't sting anymore. They sharpened her. In this moment, she didn't argue. She didn't defend herself. She simply observed. The silence stretched just long enough to become uncomfortable. Then Danielle nodded once, slowly, as if confirming something to herself rather than to them. She stood, smooth and unhurried, the chair barely making a sound against the floor. No tension, no frustration, just control. "Thank you for your time," she said, her voice steady, level, impossible to read. The executives nodded, relieved, already moving on in their minds. To them, it was over. Another candidate dismissed. Another quiet exit. But Danielle didn't rush. She gathered her portfolio, slid it under her arm, and walked toward the door with measured steps. Each one deliberate. Each one final. Her reflection followed her along the glass wall, calm, composed, unshaken. Just before she reached the door, she paused. Not long, just enough. Her hand rested lightly on the handle, but she didn't turn it yet. Behind her, the room had already started to reset. Papers shifting, low voices returning, the hum of normalcy creeping back in like nothing had happened. That's when she spoke again, without turning around, her voice cutting through the space with quiet precision. "You'll be hearing from me again." This time, the silence that followed was different. Heavier. The kind that lingers just a second too long. Jason looked up fully now, something clicking into place he couldn't yet explain. One of the executives let out a small, dismissive breath, almost a laugh, as if the statement didn't matter. As if she didn't matter. Danielle opened the door and stepped out into the hallway, the sound of her heels soft but steady against the polished floor. She didn't look back. She didn't need to. Because in her world, silence wasn't defeat. It was timing. And 3 months from now, this room wouldn't sound the same at all. The hallway outside the conference room felt colder than it should have, or maybe that was just the shift in air once Danielle Brooks stepped out of their line of sight, her pace steady, her expression unchanged, as if nothing had happened at all, but inside, everything had already begun to move, not emotionally, not impulsively, but strategically, because moments like that were never isolated for her. They were patterns, data points, confirmations of a system she had studied long before she ever walked into that building. And as the glass door closed behind her, the faint murmur of voices resumed. Inside, low, dismissive, already forgetting her presence, already categorizing her as another candidate who did not make the cut, while Danielle moved through the hallway lined with framed awards and polished branding statements about inclusion and excellence, each one reading like a contradiction she did not bother to challenge. Not out loud. Not yet. Because she understood something they did not. That power was not proven in the room where you were dismissed. It was proven in the rooms you controlled afterward. And as she reached the elevator, she pressed the button once. Calm. Deliberate. Her reflection staring back at her from the mirrored steel doors. Composed. Unreadable. A woman who had learned long ago that reactions were expensive and timing was everything. The elevator opened with a soft chime, and she stepped inside alone. The doors closing with a quiet finality that felt less like an exit and more like the beginning of something that had already been set in motion long before she ever walked into that interview. And somewhere between the 12th floor and the lobby, she exhaled slowly, not out of frustration, but out of clarity, because there was no confusion about what had just happened, no second guessing, no need to replay their words. She had heard them clearly, understood them completely, and filed them exactly where they belonged. Not as an obstacle, but as leverage. And when the elevator doors opened to the lobby, the noise of the building returned. Footsteps, conversations, the distant hum of city traffic filtering through the glass entrance. But Danielle moved through it like it was background, her focus already shifting forward, already calculating, already building. And as she stepped outside into the Chicago air, crisp and sharp against her skin, she pulled her phone from her pocket and tapped once, a single contact. No hesitation. The call connected almost instantly. "Rachel," she said, her voice calm, precise. "I just left Vanguard Strategy Group." There was a brief pause on the other end, then a familiar, efficient response. "How did it go?" Danielle's gaze lifted toward the skyline. The same skyline she had spent years learning how to navigate, not just physically, but structurally, understanding who held influence, who held leverage, and who thought they did. "Exactly as expected," she replied, her tone carrying no emotion, just certainty. "Good," Rachel said, already adjusting, already aligning with whatever came next, because she knew Danielle did not call to report failure. She called to initiate action. Danielle continued walking, her heels steady against the pavement, each step measured, each thought already organized. "I want a full profile on their current contracts, active clients, and any outstanding liabilities," she said, her voice low but firm. "Focus on vulnerabilities." There was no hesitation on the other end. "Understood." Timeline. Danielle paused just long enough to watch a black car pull up to the curb, the driver stepping out, already opening the door for her without a word. 3 months, she said, then added, "Maximum." She ended the call before any further questions, because there were none that needed asking. And as she slid into the back seat, the door closing behind her with a muted thud, the city moved around her, unaware, unchanged, while inside that car, something far more precise was already taking shape, not driven by anger, not fueled by ego, but by something far more controlled, a quiet decision made in a glass conference room where 3 people thought they were evaluating her, when in reality, they had just revealed everything she needed to know. And as the car pulled away from the curb, disappearing into the flow of traffic, Danielle Brooks did not look back at the building, not once, because in her world, you never return to prove a point, you return to change the outcome. And somewhere behind those polished windows, the people who dismissed her had no idea that the conversation they thought had ended was only just beginning. 3 days later, the report arrived before sunrise, clean, precise, and exactly what Danielle Brooks expected, because patterns like that never lied. They only waited to be seen. And as she sat at the long glass table in her own office, 32 floors above the same city that had just dismissed her, she scrolled through page after page of structured insight, not opinions, not assumptions, but facts, contracts, numbers, dependencies, every quiet weakness Vanguard Strategy Group thought was hidden beneath polished branding and confident presentations. And Rachel stood across from her, tablet in hand, already anticipating the next move, because in Danielle's world, information was not just power, it was timing, and timing was everything. Their largest client accounts for 40% of their annual revenue, Rachel said, her voice steady. The contract renews in 90 days. Danielle did not look up immediately, her eyes scanning a section marked liabilities, her fingers tapping once against the glass surface, a subtle rhythm that only meant one thing, alignment. And their second largest client, she asked calmly. Rachel swiped once. 30%, tied to performance benchmarks they have not met in the last 2 quarters. Danielle leaned back slightly, the city skyline stretching behind her through the window, sunlight cutting across the room like a quiet spotlight. So 70% of their stability depends on 2 contracts they cannot fully secure. She said, not as a question, but as confirmation. Rachel nodded once. Yes. A brief silence settled, not empty, but deliberate, the kind that comes right before something shifts, and Danielle closed the file slowly, her gaze lifting, sharp now, focused. Good, she said, and that single word carried more weight than any reaction ever could, because this was never about proving them wrong. It was about understanding exactly where they were weakest, and in that moment, she was no longer thinking about the interview, not the words, not the tone, not even the dismissal. She was thinking about structure, leverage, entry points, because that was the real game. And they had already shown her the board. Schedule a meeting with Horizon Capital, she said, her voice calm but decisive. Rachel did not hesitate. Today. Danielle stood, walking toward the window, her reflection merging with the skyline. And pull every available detail on Vanguard's debt exposure, she added. Rachel's fingers moved quickly across the screen. Already. In progress. Danielle nodded once, her mind already 3 steps ahead, because this was not revenge, not in the way people imagined it. It was repositioning, calculated, controlled, inevitable, and somewhere across the city, inside that same polished office where she had been dismissed, things were beginning to shift, small at first, almost unnoticeable. A delayed client response, a postponed call, a contract review that did not go as expected, nothing dramatic, nothing loud, just subtle. Pressure building beneath the surface and inside Vanguard. The executives who once leaned back so comfortably were starting to lean forward, checking numbers again, asking questions they had not needed to ask before, unaware that the timeline had already begun, unaware that the 90 days they thought they had were already shrinking. And back in her office, Danielle turned from the window, her expression unchanged, her focus absolute. They think they are stable, she said quietly, almost to herself. Rachel looked up, understanding immediately. They are not, Danielle replied, and there was no arrogance in her tone, no satisfaction, just certainty, because she had seen this before, built this before, executed this before. And as she reached for her phone again, dialing another number without hesitation, the pieces continued to fall into place, not by chance, not by luck, but by design. And somewhere deep within the structure of a company that had once dismissed her in less than 10 minutes, a shift had already begun, silent, precise, and completely irreversible. By the end of the second week, the pressure inside Vanguard Strategy Group was no longer subtle, it was structural, measurable, and quietly accelerating, though no one in the executive conference room could fully explain why. Only that something fell off, something just beneath the surface that refused to stabilize, and the same man who had dismissed Danielle Brooks now stood at the head of the table, flipping through updated reports with a tighter grip than usual, his confidence still present, but no longer effortless, because numbers that once aligned neatly were beginning to shift in ways that did not follow their usual patterns. Why is Horizon Capital delaying confirmation? He asked, his tone controlled but edged with urgency. The woman beside him glanced at her screen, scrolling quickly. They have not declined. They are just reviewing, she said, though even she did not sound convinced. And across the table, another executive leaned forward, tapping a pen against the surface. And our second client pushed their performance audit forward by 2 weeks, he added. That has never happened before. The room fell into a brief silence, the kind that signals awareness without clarity. And in the far corner, Jason Miller sat quietly, observing, just as he had during that interview weeks ago, except this time, he was not confused, he was connecting, because he remembered her, the calm, the precision, The way she had walked out like the decision had already been made somewhere else, and now, as he watched the room begin to shift, he felt something settle into place, not fully formed yet, but undeniable. Meanwhile, across the city, Danielle Brooks stood in a different room entirely, one built not on reaction, but on control, the boardroom of Horizon Capital, where decisions were not debated emotionally, but executed strategically. And as she stood beside the large digital display outlining Vanguard's current exposure, her voice remained steady, clear, and impossible to ignore. Their dependency ratio exceeds 70% across 2 contracts they cannot fully secure, she said, her hand gesturing once toward the data. That is not stability. That is vulnerability. The room listened, not because of her tone, but because of her accuracy, because everything she presented was already verified, already aligned, already undeniable, and one of the senior partners nodded slowly. If we reposition now, we control the outcome within 60 to 90 days. Danielle met his gaze without hesitation. Not if, she corrected calmly. When, there was no arrogance in her voice, only certainty, because this was not speculation, it was execution already in motion. And as the meeting concluded, approvals moved forward with quiet efficiency, signatures followed, access expanded, and influence shifted, not loudly, not visibly, but decisively. And back inside Vanguard, the same executives who once leaned back now found themselves leaning in, calls extending longer than expected, responses coming slower than usual, and questions that once had easy answers now requiring deeper review. We need to secure Horizon before the end of the quarter, one of them said, his voice sharper now. The urgency no longer hidden, but what they did not know, what they could not see, was that Horizon was no longer just a client under consideration. It had already begun to change direction, guided by a strategy they were not part of, and in a quiet office overlooking the same city. Danielle sat once more at her desk, reviewing the final confirmations as they came in, each one aligning with the timeline she had set the moment she walked out of that interview. Her phone buzzed softly, a message from Rachel. Initial position secured, phase 2 ready. Danielle read it once, then set the phone down, her expression unchanged, because there was nothing surprising about progress that had been designed from the start. And as she looked out over the skyline, the same skyline that had once been a backdrop to dismissal, it now reflected something entirely different: control, timing, and inevitability. And somewhere behind glass walls across the city, a company that believed it had made a simple hiring decision was beginning to realize, slowly but unmistakably, that the moment they thought was insignificant had already set something much larger into motion, something they could not stop, because it had never been about getting the job. It had always been about understanding who decided what came next. By the beginning of the 3rd month, the shift was no longer something Vanguard could ignore. It was visible in every delayed response, every tightened budget discussion, every call that ended without resolution. And inside the executive conference room, the same polished confidence that once filled the space had been replaced with something quieter, something heavier, a tension that lingered even when no one spoke. And the man who once dismissed Danielle Brooks now stood at the window instead of the head of the table, staring out at the skyline as if the answer might be written somewhere between the buildings, his reflection faint in the glass, his posture no longer relaxed but rigid, calculated, uncertain. "We need answers," he said finally, turning back to the room, his voice controlled but no longer effortless. The woman who had echoed his judgment weeks ago now sat with her laptop open, scrolling through updates that refused to settle into anything predictable. Horizon Capital has officially postponed contract renewal discussions, she said, her tone tight. They are requesting a full performance reassessment before moving forward. A silence followed, longer this time, heavier, because everyone in that room understood what that meant. Without Horizon, the foundation of their projected growth began to crack, and across the table, another executive leaned forward, fingers interlocked. "Then we secure the second client," he said quickly, as if urgency could substitute for stability. But before anyone could respond, a notification lit up the screen in front of them, a message that shifted the entire room in an instant. The second client had also initiated an independent review, earlier than scheduled, without prior notice, And this time, no one spoke immediately, because this was no longer coincidence. It was alignment, the kind that did not happen without intention. And in the corner, Jason Miller watched it all unfold, his earlier uncertainty now replaced with something clearer, sharper, because he remembered her words, not loud, not emotional, but precise. You will be hearing from me again, and now, in a room full of rising concern. It felt less like a statement and more like a timeline being fulfilled. Meanwhile, across the city, Danielle Brooks sat in a different kind of meeting, one where no one questioned her presence, one where her voice did not need to push, only to guide. The boardroom at Horizon Capital was quieter, more focused, and as she reviewed the final phase projections, her tone remained even, measured. Their response window is closing, she said, her eyes moving across the data. Once both contracts enter reassessment simultaneously, their leverage disappears. One of the senior partners nodded slowly. And at that point, he asked. Danielle looked up, meeting his gaze without hesitation. We do not negotiate, she said. We decide. The words settled into the room with clarity, not force, because everyone there understood what came next. And as the meeting concluded, the final approvals moved forward, not rushed, not forced, but inevitable, like a sequence that had already been written. And back at Vanguard, the atmosphere had shifted completely. Calls were no longer routine. They were reactive, conversations no longer strategic, but defensive, and the same executives who once evaluated candidates now found themselves being evaluated by circumstances they could not control. We need to re-establish communication with Horizon immediately, one of them said, his voice sharper now, urgency replacing authority, but every attempt returned the same response, delayed, redirected, deferred, and in that pattern, something became undeniable. They were no longer leading the conversation, they were responding to it. And in her office, Danielle stood once more by the window, the city stretching endlessly before her, her phone in hand. A single message from Rachel confirming what she already knew, Phase 3 ready. Danielle read it once, then set the phone down, her reflection steady in the glass, unchanged, because this moment, this exact point where pressure became consequence, had been set in motion the second she walked out of that interview. And now, as the final pieces aligned, the distance between dismissal and control had narrowed to almost nothing, and somewhere across the city, in a room that once dismissed her in less than 10 minutes, the realization was beginning to settle, slow, heavy, and impossible to ignore, that the person they thought did not belong had never needed their approval, only their mistake. The fourth week did not arrive with noise. It arrived with absence, the kind that unsettles even the most controlled environments. Because inside Vanguard Strategy Group, the silence from both major clients had stretched beyond delay into something far more dangerous, uncertainty without direction. And in the main conference room, the executives no longer sat in their usual positions of quiet authority. Instead, they moved, pacing, checking screens, refreshing inboxes as if repetition could force a response that refused to come. And the man who once dismissed Danielle Brooks now stood at the center of the room, not leading, not directing, but searching, his voice tighter than before. We need direct contact, not intermediaries, not assistants. I want confirmation today. But even as he spoke, the lack of response had already become the answer, because every outreach returned the same result. Polite acknowledgement followed by strategic distance, and across the table, the woman who once defined presence with quiet bias now avoided eye contact altogether, her confidence replaced with calculation, her tone softer, uncertain. There is movement behind the scenes, she said carefully. This is coordinated. And that word lingered, coordinated, because it suggested something none of them had yet said out loud, that this was not random, not accidental, but intentional, designed. And in the corner, Jason Miller no longer looked confused. He looked certain, because the pattern was too precise, too aligned, too controlled to be coincidence. And in his mind, the image of Danielle standing at the door replayed again, not as memory, but as realization. She had not been dismissed, she had exited, and that difference now mattered more than anything else in the room. Meanwhile, across the city, Danielle Brooks sat in a space defined by clarity rather than reaction, her office quiet, her desk organized, every document in place as. Rachel stepped in with a tablet, her voice efficient but carrying a subtle shift of momentum. "Final confirmations are in," she said, placing the tablet down. "Both clients have entered reassessment under Horizon oversight." Danielle did not react immediately, her eyes scanning the data once more, not because she needed confirmation, but because precision mattered, and after a brief pause, she nodded once, the smallest movement signaling the largest shift. "Then they have no leverage left," she said calmly. Rachel allowed herself a slight breath, not relief, but acknowledgement of completion, because this phase had not been easy, it had been exact, and now, the outcome was no longer forming, it was fixed. "What is the next step?" Rachel asked, though she already knew. Danielle stood, walking slowly toward the window, the skyline reflecting in the glass as if mirroring the structure she had just reshaped. "Now," she said quietly, "we stop waiting." And those words carried weight not because they were loud, but because they marked the end of something, the end of observation, the end of positioning, and the beginning of execution. And back at Vanguard, the shift became undeniable when an official notice arrived. Not a call, not a discussion, but a document, formal, structured, and impossible to ignore. A notification that Horizon Capital had assumed controlling interest over both contract negotiations moving forward, effective immediately. And as the message was read aloud, the room fell into a silence deeper than any before, because this was not delay, not hesitation. This was removal. They were no longer at the center of their own negotiations, and the man who once leaned back with certainty now stood still, completely still, as if movement itself might confirm what he was beginning to understand. That control had shifted, not gradually, but completely, and in that moment, every decision, every dismissal, every assumption made weeks ago began to reconnect, not as isolated moments, but as part of a larger sequence they had never seen forming. And across the city, Danielle turned from the window, her expression unchanged, her focus steady, because this was the point where everything aligned, not emotionally, not dramatically, but structurally. The exact moment when a system that once excluded her could no longer function without her influence. And as she reached for her phone, dialing a number that would finalize what had already been decided, the distance between who they thought she was and who she had always been collapsed entirely, leaving only one truth behind. They were no longer deciding her future, she was deciding theirs. The message did not come with explanation, it did not arrive with negotiation. It came as a directive, clean, structured, and final, and inside Vanguard Strategy Group. The moment it was projected onto the main conference screen, the room did not react immediately, because understanding it took a second longer than reading it, effective immediately. Horizon Capital will be assuming full oversight of all active contract negotiations and strategic restructuring processes. The word sat there, unmoving, undeniable, and for the first time, no one reached to interrupt, no one leaned forward to challenge, because this was not a conversation they were invited into. This was a shift they were being informed of, and the man who once dismissed Danielle Brooks lowered himself slowly into his chair, not out of exhaustion, but because standing no longer gave him any advantage. His voice, when it came, was quieter, stripped of its earlier certainty. Who authorized this? But even as he asked, he already knew the answer was not in the room. And across the table, the same executives who once spoke with ease now exchanged looks that carried something unfamiliar, not confusion, but recognition. The kind that comes when a pattern finally reveals itself too late to change it. And in the corner, Jason Miller did not look surprised at all, because for him, the moment had already connected, the silence, the delays, the coordination, and now this, the final confirmation that everything they were experiencing was not happening to them. It was happening because of someone, and that someone had already been in this room, had already stood at that door, had already told them exactly what would happen. Meanwhile, across the city, Danielle Brooks walked into a different conference room, one far larger, far quieter, and entirely aligned with her presence, the Horizon Capital boardroom, where the air did not question her, it adjusted to her. And as she took her seat at the head of the table, the shift was immediate, not announced, not declared, but understood, because authority did not need introduction when it was already recognized. And Rachel stood to her right, placing a folder down with precise timing. "Final authorization confirmed," she said, her voice steady. Danielle opened the folder without urgency, reviewing the documents not for validation, but for completion, each page representing a step that had already been executed, each signature a confirmation of a decision made long before this moment. And after a brief pause, she closed it, her gaze lifting, calm, direct. "Then we proceed," she said. And that single sentence carried the weight of everything that had led here, not as an escalation, but as a conclusion. And back at Vanguard, the silence began to fracture, not into clarity, but into realization. "We need to request a meeting," one executive said quickly, urgency breaking through composure. "We need to understand what is happening." But the answer came faster than expected, not from Horizon directly, but from a forwarded notice, a scheduled meeting already set, not requested, not negotiated, but assigned, mandatory attendance, full executive presence required. And the time, the date, the location, all defined without their input. And as the details settled in, something shifted deeper than concern. It was control, or rather, the absence of it. Because for the first time, they were not leading, not deciding, not even influencing. They were being positioned. And the man who once evaluated Danielle Brooks stared at the screen longer than the others, his expression tightening not with anger, but with something far more unsettling, recognition, because somewhere beneath the data, beneath the structure, beneath the sudden loss of control, a memory surfaced, her voice, calm, precise. "You will be hearing from me again." And now, sitting in that same room, he understood what that meant. Not a warning, not a threat, but a timeline. And across the city, Danielle stood once more by the window after the meeting concluded, the skyline unchanged, the city moving as it always had, unaware of the shift that had just taken place within it, her reflection steady, composed, untouched by the weight of what she had just finalized. Because for her, this was never about the moment of power. It was about the control of it, the ability to shape outcomes without noise, without reaction, without needing validation from the very systems that once dismissed her. And as she turned slightly, her phone vibrating once in her hand, a message from Rachel confirming the meeting had been set, the final alignment in place. Danielle did not smile. She did not react. She simply acknowledged it, because everything was exactly where it needed to be, and somewhere across the city. A room that once dismissed her in minutes was now preparing to face her again, not as a candidate, not as an outsider, but as the one person they could no longer afford to misunderstand. The morning of the meeting did not feel different to anyone walking into the building. The lobby still carried the same polished calm, the same quiet confidence that had once framed every decision made inside Vanguard Strategy Group. But for the people heading toward the executive conference room, something had shifted, something heavier than uncertainty, something closer to inevitability. And as they gathered around the table, no one spoke at first. Not because they had nothing to say, but because they did not know where to begin. The agenda had already been set for them, the time assigned, the expectation clear, and for the first time, they were not preparing to lead a discussion. They were preparing to respond to one. And the man who once dismissed Danielle Brooks adjusted his tie slightly, a small movement that carried more tension than he would have admitted. His eyes fixed on the door as if anticipating something he could not yet define, while across the table, the others sat straighter, quieter, their earlier confidence replaced by a controlled stillness. And in the corner, Jason Miller took his seat once again, not as an observer this time, but as someone who understood that what was about to happen was not just another meeting. It was a moment, the kind that changes how everything is seen afterward. And when the door finally opened, the room did not react immediately, because recognition took a second longer than sight. Danielle Brooks stepped in without hesitation, her presence filling the space not through volume, not through movement, but through certainty, her pace steady, her posture precise, her expression calm in a way that did not ask for attention but commanded it anyway. And behind her, Rachel followed, placing a folder on the table with quiet efficiency, the soft sound of it touching the glass surface echoing louder than it should have, because it marked the beginning of something none of them could stop. And Danielle did not rush to speak. She did not acknowledge the room in the way they expected. She simply took her seat at the head of the table, the same position that once belonged to someone else. And in that moment, the shift was complete, not announced, not explained, but undeniable, and the man who once leaned back with certainty now found himself leaning forward, his voice measured, careful. "You requested this meeting," he said, though even that phrasing felt outdated the moment it left his mouth. Danielle met his gaze without hesitation, her voice calm. "No," she replied, "I scheduled it." And the correction was small, but it carried weight, because it redefined everything about the room, the roles, the power, the outcome, and a silence followed, deeper than before, not uncertain, but aware, and Danielle opened the folder in front of her, not for effect, but for clarity, her eyes scanning the documents once more before she spoke again. "Over the last 90 days, your company has entered 2 simultaneous reassessments," she said, her tone steady. "Factual, both under Horizon Capital oversight." She paused just long enough for the information to settle, not because they did not know it, but because hearing it framed this way made it real in a way numbers alone had not. And across the table, one of the executives shifted slightly, attempting to regain footing. "We are aware of the reassessments," she said quickly. "We are prepared to negotiate terms." Danielle's expression did not change. "There are no negotiations," she replied. And this time, the silence that followed was immediate, because the certainty in her voice left no space for interpretation, and Jason, sitting quietly at the edge of the room, felt it fully now, the alignment, the precision, the inevitability of this moment, because what they were experiencing was not pressure, it was consequence, structured, deliberate, and complete. And Danielle closed the folder slowly, her gaze moving across each face in the room, not searching, not judging, but recognizing, and when she spoke again, her voice carried something deeper than authority, it carried finality. "Today is not about what you expected to happen," she said. "It is about what already has." And in that moment, the distance between who they thought she was and who she had always been disappeared entirely, leaving nothing but the reality they now had to face, that the room they once controlled no longer belonged to them in any way that mattered. No one spoke immediately after her last sentence, because the weight of it settled deeper than anything they had heard before, not loud, not aggressive, but precise in a way that left no room for misinterpretation. And the man who once dismissed Danielle Brooks finally leaned forward, his hands clasped tightly together on the table, as if holding on to something that was already slipping, his voice lower now, controlled but edged with something new, something closer to urgency than authority. "You are saying we no longer have decision power over our own contracts," he said carefully, choosing each word as if precision might restore balance. Danielle did not hesitate, her response immediate, calm, and absolute. "I am saying you never did." And that sentence landed heavier than anything else in the room, because it did not just describe the present, it reframed the past, every assumption, every decision, every moment of confidence they had carried into that interview weeks ago. And across the table, the woman who once spoke about client comfort shifted in her seat, her posture tightening as the reality began to connect, not just professionally, but personally. Because this was no longer about contracts or clients, it was about judgment, about the moment they believed they were evaluating someone who was, in fact, already evaluating them. And in the corner, Jason Miller felt the shift completely now, not as tension, but as clarity, because everything he had sensed before had now aligned into something undeniable. This was not a reversal, it was a reveal, and Danielle leaned back slightly in her chair, not to relax, but to create space for the truth to settle fully before she spoke again, her voice steady, measured. "90 days ago, you assessed me based on what you believed I represented," she said, her eyes moving briefly across the room, not searching for reaction, but acknowledging presence. "Today, I am assessing your company based on what you have proven." The contrast was quiet but absolute, and no one interrupted this time, because interruption required control, and control no longer belonged to them. And one of the executives attempted to regain footing, his voice sharper, defensive. "If this is about a hiring decision, then this is not how business works." But Danielle did not react to the tone. She responded only to the content. "This is not about a hiring decision," she said calmly. "It is about a pattern," and that word lingered longer than expected because it reached beyond the room, beyond the moment, into something systemic, something they could not easily dismiss. And she continued, her voice still even, still controlled. "A pattern of misjudgment that extends beyond one interview, beyond one candidate, into how you define value, credibility, and leadership." And for the first time, no one attempted to argue, because arguing required certainty. And certainty had already been removed from the room, and the man at the head of the table exhaled. Slowly, his posture shifting from resistance to recognition, because somewhere beneath the structure, beneath the contracts, beneath the numbers, the truth had become impossible to avoid. They had not just made a mistake, they had revealed one. And Danielle reached forward, sliding a document across the table, the motion smooth, deliberate, final. "This outlines the restructuring process moving forward," she said, her tone unchanged. "Effective immediately. Horizon Capital will oversee all strategic operations, including leadership evaluation." The word evaluation landed with intention and across the table. The executives understood exactly what it meant, not just for the company, but for themselves. And Jason, watching from the corner, felt something shift inside him as well. Not fear, not uncertainty, but something closer to realization, because what he was witnessing was not just power, it was accountability, structured, precise, and impossible to ignore. And Danielle stood then, not abruptly, not dramatically, but with the same calm control she had carried from the beginning, her presence steady as she looked across the room one final time. "You did not misjudge me because you lacked information," she said quietly. "You misjudged me because of what you chose to see." And this time, the silence that followed was complete, not because there was nothing to say, but because everything that needed to be understood had already been said. And as Danielle turned toward the door, her steps measured, her posture unchanged, the room remained still behind her, not frozen, but transformed, because the dynamic that once defined it had been rewritten entirely. And as the door closed, softly behind her, the sound carried a finality that no one inside could ignore, because the conversation they thought they controlled had ended in a way they never saw coming, and the consequences they now faced had already been decided long before they realized who they were dealing with. The door closed behind Danielle Brooks with a quiet precision that echoed longer than it should have, and for several seconds, no one inside the room moved, not because they were unsure what to do next, but because for the first time, they understood that what came next was no longer their decision to make. And the man who once dismissed her remained seated, his hands still resting on the table where the document now lay open in front of him, the restructuring plan clear, detailed, and already in effect. And as his eyes moved across the pages, something in his posture shifted, not dramatically, not visibly to an outsider, but enough to mark the moment when confidence turned into recognition, because this was not a negotiation, it was an outcome. And across the table, the others began to read as well, each line reinforcing the same truth: leadership review, operational oversight, performance, accountability, terms that once applied to others now applied to them. And the woman who had once spoken about client comfort exhaled slowly, her voice quieter than it had ever been. "This is a full takeover in everything but name." And no one corrected her, because no one could. And in the corner, Jason Miller sat still, his eyes moving between the executives and the document, not with confusion, but with clarity, because what he was witnessing was not collapse, it was consequence. Structured, measured, and precise. And after a long silence, the man at the head of the table finally spoke again, his tone stripped of its earlier authority, replaced now with something more honest, more grounded. "We need to respond," he said, though the words felt incomplete the moment they left his mouth. Because respond to what? Respond how? The structure had already shifted beyond reaction and across the room. Another executive shook his head slightly. "There is nothing to respond to," he said quietly. "This is already decided." And that realization settled deeper than any argument could have, because it meant the moment for influence had passed without them realizing it. And outside the room, the rest of the company had not yet fully felt the shift, but the signs were already there. Meetings rescheduled, approvals delayed, new oversight protocols introduced without explanation, subtle changes that would soon become impossible to ignore. And as the executives sat in that room, absorbing the full scope of what had just happened, the weight of their earlier decisions began to connect in ways they had not considered before, not just as a professional misstep, but as a failure of judgment, a moment where they believed they were in control, when in reality, they had already lost it. And across the city, Danielle stood once again in her office, the skyline stretching endlessly before her, her reflection steady against the glass, unchanged by the outcome because the outcome had never been uncertain to her. And Rachel stepped in quietly, placing another folder on the desk. Initial transition notices are being distributed, she said, her voice calm. Danielle nodded once, her focus already shifting forward, because this moment, while significant, was not the end. It was the beginning of something larger, something more structured, and she opened the folder, scanning the next phase. Not for confirmation, but for execution. Make sure internal communications remain clear, she said, her tone even. No ambiguity, no delays. Rachel nodded, already moving to implement. Because clarity was not just a preference, it was a standard. And as Danielle closed the folder, she allowed herself a brief pause, not to reflect on what had happened, but to acknowledge what it represented, not just control, not just authority, but alignment, the kind that comes when preparation meets opportunity at exactly the right moment. And as she turned slightly, her phone vibrating once with a message confirming that the leadership evaluations had begun, she did not react outwardly. She simply absorbed it, because everything was moving exactly as it should, and somewhere behind her, in a conference room that once dismissed her in less than 10 minutes, the people who made that decision were now facing the full weight of it, not through confrontation, not through conflict, but through a process they could not interrupt, could not reverse, and could not escape. And in that quiet, controlled unraveling, the difference between perception and reality had finally been made clear, not through words, but through consequence. The changes did not arrive all at once. They unfolded with quiet precision, one decision at a time, one notification at a time, until the entire structure inside Vanguard Strategy Group began to shift in ways that could no longer be ignored. And within 48 hours, the first official notices were sent, not publicly, not dramatically, but directly to the individuals whose names now appeared under Leadership Evaluation Review. And when the emails landed, the reactions varied. Some read them twice, others stared without opening them for several minutes. But all of them understood one thing immediately. This was not a warning. This was a process already in motion. And in the same conference room where everything had changed, the executives gathered again, not by choice, but by necessity. Their posture different now, less defined by authority and more by awareness. And the man who once led every discussion now spoke with a measured restraint. "We need to cooperate fully," he said, his voice controlled but carrying an undercurrent of something new, acceptance, because resistance no longer served a purpose. And across from him, the woman who had once defined who did and did not fit into their image sat quietly, her hands folded together as if holding onto something that was no longer there. And for the first time, she spoke without confidence. "They are not just reviewing operations," she said, her tone lower, more deliberate. "They are reviewing us." And that realization settled into the room with a weight that could not be dismissed, because it meant that every decision they had made, every judgment they had issued, was now part of the evaluation they could not control. And in the corner, Jason Miller sat once again, but this time, he was not simply observing. He was witnessing the transformation of a system that had once seemed fixed, and as he watched the room adjust to a reality it had never prepared for, he understood something that the others were only beginning to accept. That power did not disappear, it shifted, and when it did, it revealed everything it had once concealed. Meanwhile, across the city, Danielle Brooks moved through her own day with the same steady precision that had guided every step leading to this moment. Her office unchanged, her schedule uninterrupted, because the outcome unfolding at Vanguard was not an event she needed to attend. It was a process she had already set in motion. And as Rachel entered with the latest updates, her voice remained consistent, efficient. "Initial evaluations are underway, and external consultants have been assigned to each department. Danielle nodded once. Not surprised, not reactive, because this was alignment, not escalation. And internal feedback, she asked. Rachel glanced at the tablet. Mixed, but shifting, she replied. There is recognition of systemic issues. Danielle paused for a moment, her gaze moving toward the skyline once again, not to reflect, but to measure distance, progress, control. Recognition is the first step, she said quietly, her voice carrying no judgment, only clarity. And back inside Vanguard, the shift continued, not through confrontation, but through exposure, processes reviewed, decisions questioned, patterns identified, and the same individuals who once defined standards now found themselves being measured against them. And as the hours passed, something became undeniable. This was not just a restructuring of operations, it was a restructuring of perspective, a forced alignment between what the company claimed to represent and what it had actually practiced. And for those inside the room, the realization came, slowly but completely, that the moment they dismissed Danielle Brooks had not been an isolated decision. It had been a reflection, and now, that reflection was being examined in a way they could not avoid. And across the city, Danielle stood once more at her window, the city moving below her in its usual rhythm, unchanged, unaware, but within that movement, she understood something deeper. That real change did not come from confrontation. It came from structure, from systems that held people accountable without needing to raise a voice. And as she turned back toward her desk, her expression steady, her focus already on what came next, the difference between what they believed about her and who she had always been had fully collapsed, leaving only one outcome behind. Not just control, not just authority, but clarity, the kind that reshapes everything it touches without ever needing to announce itself. By the end of the week, the transformation inside Vanguard Strategy Group was no longer subtle. It was visible in every interaction, every meeting, every conversation that now carried a different tone, a different weight, because the structure that once protected assumptions had been replaced with one that examined them. And inside the executive floor, the atmosphere had shifted from quiet confidence to careful awareness, where every decision was now made under a lens that could not be ignored. And in the main conference room, the same individuals who once dictated outcomes now sat with a different posture, not defeated, but recalibrated, as external consultants presented their findings, not with emotion, not with accusation, but with clarity, patterns identified, inconsistencies highlighted, leadership behaviors mapped against performance outcomes. And the language used was precise, professional, but impossible to dismiss. And the man who once dismissed Danielle Brooks listened without interruption, his expression steady but no longer guarded, because resistance had already proven ineffective. And now, understanding was the only path forward. And across the table, the woman who once defined who belonged and who did not sat quietly, her earlier certainty replaced by reflection, because hearing those patterns described in structured terms made them real in a way she could not avoid. And for the first time, she spoke not to defend, but to acknowledge. We built a system that rewarded familiarity, she said slowly, her voice measured, not necessarily capability. And that statement did not echo. It settled, because it was not just an admission, it was a shift. And in the corner, Jason Miller watched the moment unfold, recognizing it for what it truly was, not collapse, not failure, but exposure, the kind that forces change whether it is welcomed or not. And across the city, Danielle Brooks reviewed the same findings from a different perspective, not as criticism, but as confirmation, each report aligning with what she had already understood, each conclusion reinforcing the structure she had put in place. And as Rachel stood beside her, summarizing the key outcomes, her voice remained steady. The evaluations are consistent across departments. The same patterns appear in leadership decisions, hiring practices, and client engagement strategies. Danielle nodded once, her focus sharp, because consistency in data meant clarity in action. Then the next phase moves forward, she said calmly. Rachel paused briefly, then added, there is internal acknowledgement beginning to form. Danielle allowed a slight pause, not out of hesitation, but consideration. Because acknowledgement was not the goal, it was the beginning. Recognition changes perception, she said quietly. but structure changes behavior. And that distinction defined everything about what came next. And back inside Vanguard, the impact of that structure became undeniable as recommendations transitioned into implementation, leadership roles adjusted, oversight increased, accountability measures enforced, not through confrontation, but through process. And the same individuals who once operated without question now found themselves operating within a system that required alignment, transparency, and measurable results. And as the hours passed, something deeper began to take hold, not just compliance, but awareness, a realization that the way things had been done was no longer sustainable, not under this structure, not under this level of visibility. And in that realization, a different kind of shift began, one that moved beyond reaction into adaptation. And across the city, Danielle stood once more at her window, the skyline reflecting back at her with the same steady clarity she carried within herself. Because this moment was not about control alone, it was about correction, not of individuals, but of systems. And as she turned back toward her desk, reviewing the final updates for the day, her expression remained unchanged, calm, focused, precise. Because the work was not finished, it had only reached the point where its impact could no longer be denied. And somewhere behind glass walls across the city, the company that once believed it, understood what value looked like, was now learning to see it differently, not through assumption, not through comfort, but through clarity, the kind that does not raise its voice, but changes everything it touches. The final shift did not arrive with announcement or spectacle. It settled quietly, almost imperceptibly at first, until it became undeniable in every corner of Vanguard Strategy Group. In the way conversations were held, in the way decisions were made, in the way silence now carried more awareness than confidence ever had. And weeks after that meeting, the company no longer resembled the one Danielle Brooks had walked into, because the structure had changed, not just externally, but internally, in the way people thought, evaluated, and recognized value. And inside the executive floor, the same conference room now held a different kind of presence, one defined not by authority, but by accountability. And as leadership reviews concluded, some positions were reassigned, others redefined, and some quietly removed from influence altogether, not as punishment, but as consequence, structured and aligned with the new system in place. And the man who once dismissed Danielle no longer sat at the head of the table, his role adjusted, his influence measured, not erased, but recalibrated. And for the first time, he spoke in a room without assuming control, his voice steady, but grounded. "We move forward differently," he said, not as a directive, but as an understanding. And across from him, the woman who once spoke with certainty about who fit and who did not now contributed in a different way. Her perspective no longer shaped by assumption, but by awareness, because the process had not just changed outcomes, it had changed understanding. And in the corner, Jason Miller no longer sat as an observer. He had been brought into discussions, his voice valued not because of position, but because of clarity, because he had seen what others missed when it mattered most. And across the city, Danielle Brooks stood once again in her office, the skyline reflecting a city that had not changed, but within it, something had, something subtle yet permanent. And Rachel stepped in with the final report, placing it down with the same precision as always. "Full transition complete," she said. Danielle opened it, reviewing not for confirmation, but for closure, each section aligning exactly with the structure she had designed, each outcome reflecting the intention she had carried from the very beginning. And after a moment, she closed the file, her gaze steady, her expression unchanged, because this was never about the moment of victory. It was about the integrity of the process. And she walked toward the window once more, looking out over the city, her reflection merging with the skyline, calm, composed, unshaken. Because she had never needed the room that once rejected her. She had only needed the truth it revealed. And after a brief silence, she spoke, not loudly, not for anyone else to hear, but as a statement that defined everything that had happened. "They did not lose control because I took it," she said quietly. "They lost it the moment they decided who deserved it." And the words settled into the space with the same quiet authority that had shaped every step of her journey. Because in the end, nothing had been forced, nothing had been rushed, everything had unfolded exactly as it should, through clarity, through structure, through a power that never needed to prove itself, only to exist, and somewhere across the city, in a company that now operated under a new understanding. The impact of that realization continued to unfold, not as a reminder of what had been lost, but as a foundation for what could finally be built correctly. And Danielle Brooks turned from the window, her focus already shifting forward, because for her, this was never the end of the story. It was simply the moment where everything aligned, and the world finally saw what had been there all along.